The hall was enormous. It was so large that the light from the ceiling took a full second to reach the floor. The walls were made of a pale stone that no human had ever seen on Earth. The seats curved inward like a bowl, row after row, filled with creatures of every shape and size. Some had 4 arms, some had no eyes, some breathed air that had to be pumped through tubes attached to their chests, but all of them were watching the same thing. They were watching the stage. Tail Kong sat near the back of the observer gallery. He was young, 26 years old, with short black hair and a notepad on his knee. He was not supposed to be nervous. His job was simple. He was the aide and translator for Ambassador Yuna Bayek, and today was supposed to be a normal session of the Galactic Conclave. There were 212 species seated in that hall. Humanity was not one of them. Humanity sat in the gallery. Humanity observed. That was the rule. Yuna sat beside him. She was not writing anything. She was not reading anything. She was simply watching the stage with both hands folded in her lap. She had dark eyes and a calm face. Tail had worked with her for 3 years, and he had never once seen her look surprised. He sometimes wondered if she was even capable of it. Elder Vostai walked to the center of the stage. He was tall, even by the standards of his species. His skin was pale blue and pulled tightly over long bones. He moved slowly, with the kind of slowness that comes not from weakness, but from age. He was, by the Council's own records, over 400 years old. He had been Archon of the Galactic Conclave for 90 of those years. When he spoke, every translator implant in the hall activated at once. He said that today was an important day. He said that the Conclave had a responsibility to all life in the galaxy. He said that responsibility sometimes meant making difficult decisions. He paused after each sentence, the way someone does when they want the weight of their words to settle before they add more. Tail started writing. Vostai introduced Resolution 7 Omega. He called it the safeguarding of the human species. He read from the document slowly. He said that humanity was young. He said that the galaxy was dangerous. He said that there were threats in deep space that young species often could not see until it was too late. He said the Conclave had watched humanity with great care and great concern, and that out of love and wisdom, the Council was proposing the following measures. Human ships would be limited to a designated corridor of space. They could not travel beyond it without Council permission. Human military technology would be capped at its current level and monitored by a Council committee. Human research into certain scientific fields would require Council pre-approval before publication or continuation. He did not name those scientific fields. He called this protection. He called it a gift. He said it with a warm voice. Tail stopped writing. His pen was still touching the paper, but he was not moving it. He was reading back what he had just written. He read it again. He looked up at Yuna. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded. Her face had not changed. The vote was called. One by one, the species of the Galactic Conclave pressed the buttons at their seats. The board at the front of the hall filled with green lights. 211 green lights. One empty space where humanity's button would have been. If humanity had been allowed a button, the vote was complete in under 4 minutes. Resolution 7 Omega passed. There was a sound in the hall that was not quite applause. Different species expressed approval in different ways. Some clicked their teeth. Some tapped the floor with their feet. Some made a low humming sound. Together, it was like a wave rolling through the room. Vostai nodded slowly and began to turn away from the podium. Ambassador Bike. Tail turned. One of the human embassy staff at the end of the row had leaned over and pressed a small handheld microphone into Yuna's direction. It was a courtesy microphone. Observers were allowed to make brief statements at the end of sessions. It was meant for things like expressing gratitude or asking about procedure. Nobody had ever used it for anything important. Yuna reached out and took it. She stood up. The sound in the hall faded. Species that had been turning to speak to their neighbors stopped and turned back. Vossitai, who had already begun walking away from the podium, stopped walking. Yuna did not clear her throat. She did not shuffle papers. She simply stood with the microphone in one hand and looked at the stage. The Council has declared that humanity requires safeguarding, she said. Her voice came out through every speaker in the hall, calm and clear. The translator implants carried it to every species in every seat. She spoke in standard Galactic Common, which she had learned in 8 months, a fact that had quietly unsettled several council members when they first heard about it. "I have only one question," she said. The hall was very quiet now, not politely quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone is holding still because they sense something is about to happen, and they do not want to miss it. Yuna looked directly at Vostai. From whom? 2 words. That was all. Teo looked at the board where the vote results were still displayed. He looked at Vostai on the stage. The Archon was standing perfectly still. His long, pale hands were at his sides. His face showed nothing. But Tale had spent 3 years learning to watch people carefully because Yuna had told him it was the most important skill a translator could have. And Tale saw it, just for a moment. A flicker behind the old alien's eyes that was not confusion and was not anger. It was fear. Vosatai raised one hand and spoke a single word in his own language. His translator implant did not carry it, but every species in the hall understood the gesture. Session adjourned. People began to move. Voices rose. The hall filled with noise again. Tail sat very still in his seat, holding his notepad, watching Vostai walk off the stage. The old Archon did not look back, but his steps for just a moment were faster than they had been before. Tail wrote one line at the bottom of his notes. He was afraid of the question. He underlined it twice. The Earth Embassy on Nexus Station was not impressive by galactic standards. It was a set of 12 rooms on the lower ring of the station, with human furniture, human lighting, and a coffee machine that Tail had carried in his personal bag when he first arrived. The walls were thin. The windows looked out at the docking bay instead of the stars. But it was theirs, and right now it was the most important 12 rooms in the galaxy. Yuna sat at the head of the table and said nothing for a long time after they returned from the Grand Chamber. Tail put a cup of coffee in front of her. She did not drink it. She just looked at it. "Get me Mirai," she said finally. Tail made the call. Mirai Song was not a diplomat. She was not a soldier. She was the director of Earth's Xenological Intelligence Bureau, which was a long title that meant she was the person humanity sent when it needed to understand something no one else could understand. She had once decoded a species' entire written language using only their trade receipts. She had done it in 11 days. When Tail told people that story, they usually smiled politely because they did not believe him. She answered the call from her office on Nexus Station's research level 3 floors down. She had already seen the broadcast. Everyone had seen the broadcast. Yuna's 2 words had been carried on every galactic communication channel within minutes. Mirai was already eating at her desk and pulling files. "I need you to find out why," Yuna said. Mirai looked up from her screen. "I started an hour ago," she said. Yuna almost smiled. Mirai began with the obvious. She pulled everything the Conclave had ever publicly said about Resolution 7 Omega. The language was careful and soft. Every sentence sounded kind. Words like care and protection and guidance appeared over and over. But Mirai had spent her career reading documents written by people who did not want to say what they meant, and she knew that the most important information in any document was what was missing from it. The resolution named certain fields of research that would require council pre-approval, but it did not say which fields. It was the only part of the document that was vague. Everything else was specific. The corridor of space was mapped with exact coordinates. The cap on military technology was described in detailed categories, but the research restriction was just a phrase. Certain fields of human scientific inquiry as determined by the council. That vagueness was not an accident. Mirai started looking for the edge of that vagueness. She cross-referenced the filing date of the resolution with every significant piece of human scientific activity in the 3 months before it was submitted. She was looking for something that matched, something that would explain why a specific research restriction had been written without being named. 3 weeks earlier, a research vessel called the ISV Persistence had sent an internal encrypted report to the Earth Science Directorate. The Persistence was 14 light-years away, working in deep space. Its lead xenobiologist was a woman named Narration. The report described something her team had found, a self-replicating organic structure of unknown origin that existed in open space, woven between star systems like a web no one had ever noticed before. The structure responded to neural frequencies, human neural frequencies specifically. When instruments tuned to human brainwave patterns were activated near it, the structure reacted. It moved. It changed shape. It did something that Nara's report carefully described as appearing to respond with intent. It did not respond to any other species. Mirai put her fork down. The Persistence's report had been transmitted on a secure internal channel. It was not public. It was not even widely distributed within Earth's own government, but the Council had filed Resolution 7 Omega exactly 4 days after that transmission. She pulled the Council's internal communication logs, which she was technically not authorized to access, using a method she would describe to no one. She found a message sent from a Council Research Monitoring Office to Vostai's personal channel. The message was short. It contained a list of research categories. Every single one of them matched the work Narration was doing on the Persistence. Mirai sent a single message to Yuna. They weren't protecting us from the galaxy. They were protecting themselves from us. Yuna read the message in the embassy kitchen. She stood at the counter for a moment, then walked to the window that looked out at the docking bay. Outside, in the bay, she could see a conclave patrol ship drifting slowly past. It was larger than any Earth vessel by a factor of 3. Its hull was old and dark, and scarred by 100 years of service. It looked powerful. She thought about Junho. Commander Junho Lim was the head of Earth's defense fleet. He was a quiet man who communicated in short sentences and made decisions faster than most people could finish thinking about the question. He had been tracking the conclave session from his flagship 3 star systems away. She had not called him. She had not needed to. He called her. "I heard the session," he said when she picked up. "I know," she said. "I'm running a scheduled rotation," he said. She knew what that meant. It meant he was moving ships, not toward anyone, not in a way that looked like a threat, just repositioning, the way a careful player moves pieces without announcing a strategy. When he was done, every Earth vessel would be exactly where it needed to be, watching the right doors, covering the right corridors, not pointing anything at anyone, just ready. "How long?" she asked. 48 hours, he said. "Good," she said, and ended the call. Tail was standing in the doorway. He had heard enough. He did not look like the idealistic young man who had sat in the gallery that morning trying not to be nervous. He looked like someone who had just understood that the world he lived in was shaped differently than he had been taught. "What do we do now?" he asked. Yuna picked up her coffee from the counter. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "Now," she said, "we find out how deep this goes." Tail nodded and went back to his disk. Mirai, 3 floors below, had already found the bottom. It was worse than any of them expected. The file was 300 years old. Mirai found it in a sealed section of the Council's historical archive, buried under layers of access restrictions that were old enough to have been written in a version of the Conclave's administrative language that was no longer in common use. The file was labeled in that old language. Mirai translated it herself, word by word. Sitting alone in her office at 2 in the morning with cold tea and a growing feeling of cold dread, the file was about a species called the Veli. The Veli had been a spacefaring civilization roughly 300 years ago. They were described in the Council's own records as intelligent, curious, and fast-growing. They had developed interstellar travel quickly, made contact with several species, and been granted observer status in the Conclave within a generation of their first contact. The records noted with careful language that the Veli showed an unusual interest in deep space phenomena, that they asked questions other species did not ask, that they were developing technologies that the Council found difficult to categorize. 300 years ago, the Conclave had passed a resolution. It was called the Welfare Protection Act for Developing Civilizations. The language was warm. The words care and protection and guidance appeared over and over. Human vessels would be restricted, military technology would be capped, research would require pre-approval. The structure was identical to Resolution 7 Omega, identical in the same way that a copy is identical to an original when someone has tried very carefully to make it look like a different document. The Veli had accepted it. The file did not say why. Maybe they had trusted the Council, maybe they had not understood what it meant, maybe they had simply been outvoted and outmaneuvered. The file noted, in a small final paragraph, the current status of the Veli civilization. The word was contained. Mirai sat with that word for a long time. Contained did not mean extinct. The Veli still existed. They lived in a small cluster of approved star systems. They had ships, but the ships were old now and could not be upgraded. They had research programs, but the programs required council approval at every step, and approval was slow. And after a few generations, the researchers had stopped sending applications because the applications never came back. They were alive. They were comfortable. They were going nowhere. They had been stopped at the moment when they were becoming something the council did not understand and could not control. Mirai sent everything to Yuna. Yuna read it on the embassy table with Tail sitting across from her. Tail read it over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Then Yuna stood up and made a call to Earth. Prime Minister Dion O was not a dramatic person. She was a small woman in her late 50s who had spent 30 years in government and had developed the habit of cutting directly to the point because she had found that everything else was a waste of time. She listened to Yuna without interrupting. She asked no questions until Yuna finished. Then she asked one. How long before the restrictions take effect? 30 days. Yuna said. Dayon was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then we have 29 days to make sure they never do, she said, and ended the call. Yuna set her phone down on the table. Tail had already opened his own notebook and was writing a list of names. This was the part of Tail that people underestimated. He was young, and he smiled too easily, and he sometimes asked questions that made experienced diplomats wince with their simplicity. But he had been on Nexus Station for 3 years. And in 3 years, he had done something that no Earth diplomat had ever done before him. He had made friends. Not formal allies, not treaty partners. Friends. The kind you eat bad food with at 2 in the morning. The kind who teach you card games that take 4 hands to play and laugh when you lose. The kind who tell you things they would not say in a meeting room. The list he was writing contained 19 names, 19 representatives from 19 species. None of them were powerful. Most of them were small civilizations, observer status members of the conclave, species that sat in the gallery just like humanity did, species that the council ignored because they did not matter enough to worry about. Several of them, Tail now suspected, had their own sealed files. He passed the list to Yuna without a word. She read it. Her eyes moved down the page. When she finished, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. It was not quite surprise, but it was close. How many of these owe you a dinner? She asked. All 19, he said. She handed the list back. Set up the dinners. On the other side of the station, in a private council chamber that had been swept for surveillance devices 3 times in the past week, Vostai met with Delegate Rune. Rune was the one who had drafted Resolution 7 Omega. He was younger than Vostai by a century, which still made him old by most standards. He was also more nervous than Vostai, which was not difficult. Rune said that the ambassador's question had caused problems. He said it had spread across every network in the galaxy. He said that some species were asking questions now. He said they needed to accelerate the implementation of the resolution before the momentum built further. He proposed moving the timeline from 30 days to 72 hours. Vostai listened. He looked at the table. He thought about the question Yuna had asked in the Grand Chamber. 2 words. From whom? He had not answered because he did not have an answer that could be said out loud. The real answer was something the council had never said out loud in 4,000 years of governance. He agreed to the acceleration. What neither of them knew was that the room had been swept 3 times for standard surveillance devices, and a standard sweep finds standard devices. The small piece of technology that Mirai Song had placed behind the ventilation panel 2 days earlier was not standard. It had been built from parts that were not available on any council-approved supply list because it had been built from the kinds of things that humans put together when they are not asking permission. By the time Rune left the chamber, Mirai had the recording. By the time Vostai returned to his office, Tail had sent dinner invitations to 19 representatives. By the time the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle, Junho's fleet rotation was nearly complete. Nobody slept much on the Earth side of Nexus Station that night, but nobody was tired either. There is a particular kind of energy that comes from knowing exactly what is happening and having a plan. It is not calm, it is not comfortable, but it is very, very focused. And 14 light years away, in the cold and quiet dark of deep space, The ISV Persistence drifted slowly through a structure that no other species had ever noticed, and Narration sat at her instruments with her team gathered behind her, watching the organic lattice respond to every breath they took. It was waiting for something. She was starting to think she knew what. The grand chamber of the Galactic Conclave was full again. It was not supposed to be a public session. Vostai had called it as a closed procedural meeting, which was a type of session that did not require advance notice to observer species and did not allow gallery access. It was the kind of meeting used for administrative matters that the council did not want to discuss in front of an audience. The observer gallery was full anyway. 19 species were seated there when Vostai walked onto the stage. He stopped when he saw them. He stood at the edge of the stage for a moment, looking up at the gallery. And then he looked at the floor in front of him, and then he looked at his own hands. There was no rule that said observers could not attend a closed session if they arrived before it was officially declared closed. It was a gap in the Conclave's procedural code that no one had ever used before, because no one had ever tried. All 19 representatives had small recording devices on the desks in front of them. The devices were visible, placed on the surface openly and clearly. This was also deliberate. Yuna walked in last. She sat in the front row of the gallery. She had a single folder on her desk. Rune moved immediately to delay the session. He said there were attendance irregularities. He said the chamber needed to be cleared of unauthorized observers. He looked at Vostai for support. Vostai said nothing. Yuna stood. She said that she had a formal presentation to make under Article 44 of the Conclave's own charter, which allowed any observer status representative to present factual evidence to a full session if that evidence directly concerned the rights of their species. She said that the representatives in the gallery were there as witnesses, which was permitted under the same article. She said that if the council had questions about Article 44, she could recite it from memory. She had memorized it 6 months ago. She had memorized the 3 articles around it as well, in case someone tried to use one of them against her. Nobody asked her to recite it. She opened the folder. The first thing she presented was the file on the Veli. She put it on the chamber's main display screen. She walked through it slowly, section by section, explaining in plain language what had happened to them 300 years ago. She noted the resolution that had been passed. She noted the identical structure of that resolution compared to Resolution 7 Omega. She put both documents side by side on the screen. There was noise in the chamber. Species that had voted for the resolution 3 days ago were now looking at each other. Rune said the Veli comparison was misleading and irrelevant. Yuna moved to the second item. She showed the council's internal communication that Mirai had found. The message from the Research Monitoring Office to Vostai's channel, sent 4 days after Nara's report from the Persistence. She showed the list of research fields in that message. She showed how each one matched Nara's work exactly. She showed the timeline. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She simply put the facts in order and let them sit there in front of 4,000 years of galactic governance and refused to move until everyone in the room had looked at them. Rune said the document was fabricated from the Earth Embassy server room 3 floors below the station. Mirai's voice came through on the chamber's open channel. She explained in technical language that she then immediately translated into simple language for everyone's benefit. The cryptographic authentication process that confirmed the document was genuine. She showed the verification chain. She showed that the file had not been altered. She showed the original timestamp matched the council's own server logs. Then she showed the server logs. Rune moved to close the channel. He did not know that Junho Lim had completed his fleet rotation 46 hours ago. He did not know that 2 Earth ships were now sitting at exact positions between Nexus Station's broadcast inhibitor array and the relay network that carried signals across 14 star systems. The ships were not aiming anything at anyone. They were just there, in those specific spots, the way a person stands in a doorway without blocking it, but making it understood that they know where the doorway is. The channel stayed open. Then the 19 species in the gallery began to speak, one at a time, in the order Tail had arranged, which he had arranged based on which of them had the most to say and which of them said it best. Some of them were nervous. Some of them had never spoken in the Grand Chamber before. One of them, a small gray creature who represented a species of barely 40 million people, spread across 3 small moons, spoke in a voice that shook at first and then steadied. She said that her government had found their own sealed file 3 nights ago. She said the word in it was also contained. 6 other representatives said the same thing. They had each found their files after Teal had mentioned, very carefully over dinner, that it might be worth checking. He had not told them what to look for. He had simply suggested that questions were worth asking. They had asked them. The chamber was louder now. The species that had voted for Resolution 7 Omega without thinking about it were thinking about it now. The council floor was fractured. Members who had not been part of the original plan were standing and calling for a formal review. The conclave's own charter allowed for a vote to be challenged and reopened if new evidence was presented. Article 71. Una had memorized that one too. Vossistai sat in his Archon's chair and did not speak. He looked at Una across the chamber floor. She was standing at the gallery rail, one hand resting on it, watching the room. She was not smiling. She was not gloating. She was just watching, the way someone watches when they knew this was coming and feel no particular satisfaction in being right. Then the all-channel broadcast chime sounded through every speaker in the room. Every head turned toward the main screen. Narration's face appeared from the bridge of the ISV Persistence, 14 light-years away. She said that she had completed a translation. She said it had taken her team 3 weeks of careful work and 2 days of very little sleep. She said that the organic lattice they had found in deep space was not a natural phenomenon. It had been built. She did not know by whom or when, but the materials in it were structured too precisely to be anything other than intentional. She said it was built to wait. She said it had been waiting for a species that would do a specific thing before it would respond. Not a species with the largest fleet, not a species with the oldest civilization, not a species with the most votes in a governing body. A species that would ask a question before assuming it knew the answer. The message inside the lattice was a map. It showed regions of space that no chart in the Conclave's 4,000-year archive had ever included. It showed things at the edge of the galaxy and beyond it. It showed that the known galaxy, the one the Conclave had governed and mapped and argued over, was a small, bright corner of something much, much larger. The chamber was absolutely silent. Voss Tai looked at the screen. Then he looked at Una. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The question had already been answered. The vote to nullify Resolution 7 Omega passed on a Wednesday morning. It was not a close vote. 189 species voted to throw it out. 23 voted to keep it. Those 23 were the ones who had known what the resolution really was, or the ones who had too much to lose by admitting they had voted for something they did not understand. The rest of the conclave had spent 2 days reading the evidence, reading the Valley file, reading the files of 7 other species, and deciding that they did not want to be part of that history anymore. Vostai resigned his position as Archon before the vote was finished. He did it quietly, with a single written statement delivered to the Council's administrative office. The statement used very careful language and did not admit to anything, but it also did not deny anything. He left Nexus Station on a private transport the same afternoon. No one saw him off. Rune did not resign. He faced a tribunal instead. The legal process would take months, maybe years. The Conclave's justice system was old and moved slowly, which was both its greatest flaw and, in this case, its one useful feature. It meant the proceedings would be public, documented, and impossible to erase. Una sat in the embassy the evening after the vote. Tail brought her tea. She actually drank it this time. The embassy felt different than it had a week ago, though nothing in it had changed. Same thin walls. Same view of the docking bay, same coffee machine that Tail had carried in his bag, but the weight of the previous week was sitting differently on everything now. Not heavier, just more real. You should sleep, Tail said. I will, she said. She did not. She sat at the table and wrote a long message to Prime Minister Dion O. Not a report, not a formal summary, just a message in plain language explaining what had happened and what it meant. She told Dion that winning one vote did not fix a 4,000-year-old institution. She said that the council would adapt. It would find new language, new resolutions with different names, but the same shape. She said the work was not over. She said it had barely started. She sent the message just before the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle. Then she sat for a while longer, looking at the dark window and the docking bay outside. Dion's reply came the next morning. It was 4 sentences long. I know. That is why we sent you. Rest today. Be ready tomorrow. Yuna folded her hands on the table and read it 3 times. Commander Junho Lim stood down the fleet the same morning the vote passed. He did it exactly the way he had moved them into position, quietly, without announcement, without drama. Each ship returned to a standard patrol route as if it had simply been passing through. His log entry for the entire operation was 6 words long. Rotation complete. No engagement. Position nominal. He underlined nothing because he was not the kind of person who underlined things. But that evening, in his private log, which no one else ever read, he wrote something longer. He wrote that he had spent his career preparing for a war with someone, that he had run simulations against council fleets and mapped their weapons and studied their tactics because that was his job, and he was good at it. But in all of that time, in all of those plans, the scenario that had just played out was not one he had trained for. The victory had been won in a gallery, with a folder of documents, by a woman who did not raise her voice once and did not need him to fire a single thing. He said he was glad about that. He wrote that he thought it was worth recording for whoever read it someday. Then he closed the log and went to eat dinner with his crew. On Earth, Prime Minister Daeyeon-oh made a short broadcast. It was not long. She did not stand at a podium with flags behind her. She stood in a simple room with a window showing the city outside, ordinary and familiar, and she spoke the way she always spoke, directly, without decoration. She said that 60 years ago, humanity had looked up and wondered if it was alone. 30 years ago, it had learned it was not. She said today it had learned something else, that the galaxy was not automatically a place of fairness or safety or good intent. That old power could dress itself in gentle language. That protection could be used as a cage if the people inside it stopped asking what the cage was for. She did not say humanity had won. She said humanity had been noticed. She said there was a difference. She said the children watching should remember that the most powerful thing any civilization could do was ask a clear question and refuse to accept a non-answer. Then she said goodnight and ended the broadcast. In the weeks that followed, the 19 small species that had stood in the gallery during the confrontation came together with humanity and 12 others to form what they called simply the Coalition. Its first formal resolution proposed that the Galactic Conclave officially recognize the right of every species to grow, to reach, and to ask. It passed with 189 votes. Tail Kong drafted the language of the resolution himself. It took him 3 days. He wrote it in his room at the embassy with the coffee machine running in the background and his old notepad open on the desk. When he finally sent the draft to Yuna, she read it twice, made one small change to a single sentence in the middle, and told him it was good. He kept the notepad. The last page still had his note from the Grand Chamber, written the day the whole thing began. He was afraid of the question. He did not erase it. He liked having it there. It reminded him that the most dangerous thing humanity had ever carried into the galaxy was not a weapon, or a fleet, or a political strategy. It was curiosity, the stubborn, inconvenient, unstoppable habit of looking at something and asking why. Narration followed the map. The ISV Persistence crossed out of known space 11 days after the vote, with a crew of 11 and a hull covered in a living lattice that hummed quietly against the cold of deep space. The map Nara had translated showed places no species had ever logged, not because they were hidden, but because no one had looked. Or, more accurately, because the species that might have looked had been quietly contained before they could. The lattice responded to every question the crew asked, not with words, with direction, with small shifts in light and warmth that guided them forward, the way a current guides a ship. Whatever had built it had known that questions were not just curiosity. They were a form of readiness. A species that could ask the right thing before acting was a species that could be trusted with what it found. Nara sat at the front of the ship as it crossed the boundary and looked out at a part of the galaxy that no chart had ever included. Her crew stood behind her. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the younger researchers said quietly, "What do you think is out there?" Nara looked out at the dark and the stars and the vast distance ahead of them. "I don't know," she said. She smiled. "Let's go find out." Far behind them, growing smaller with every second, the known galaxy glowed like a single bright room in a house whose size no one had yet measured. And for the first time in 4,000 years, a door that had been very carefully kept closed was standing open. Not because someone had forced it, because someone had finally thought to ask what was behind it.